Hello, my loves, and welcome back to either Strange Playgrounds or Our Lives in Horror, depending on which channel you're listening to this on. If you go and watch my playlist on Not the Same Log, the film and media podcast that I do with Jack Graham and Elliot Chapman, you'll find that there is this preoccupation that comes up in the material we discuss. It happens so often, it's become almost like a running theme. And it's certainly something that preoccupies me in terms of the fiction that I both produce and consume. And it's this notion of characters within fiction that the plot bends around, or that seem to have the capacity to bend plot around them. Now, this happens far more often than most people consciously realize. If you're a writer, if you do create fiction of your own, you become keenly aware of it because it's a tool. It's something you have to use, and it's also something that you have to learn to surrender to because there are always characters in any given piece of fiction whom the plot bends around. Now, some narratives, the narratives I really tend to really go for, the ones I really like, tend to acknowledge that factor and run with it to the point whereby it becomes a theme, it becomes part of the material subject. It's that strange form of, it's a kind of solipsism in a strange kind of way, or subjectivity in which the character is not necessarily aware of the fact that they're fictional, although that can also happen. It's just that they become aware that the world is malleable around them. It happens in, for example, I mean, a classic example. It's Baudrillardian. You know, it's postmodern, it's hyper real. It's this notion of simulations, essentially. It's something that's explored quite a lot in the fiction of William Gibson, for example. Cyberpunk explores this notion a lot, especially when you get into virtual reality states like you do in Neuromancer, for example. Neuromancer is a great example of this, actually. Um, in Neuromancer, you have a character who is very difficult to pin down, as you do in a lot of cyberpunk fiction, but particularly in William Gibson's fiction, because you never know on what level of reality, quote unquote, they're operating on. So they could be jacked into a virtual space. You just don't know. There are like levels of simulation that happen in Neuromancer, and you find out as the plot progresses that what you assumed was reality is not, and then what you assume is the woken reality is also not. That's also simulated, to the point whereby it effectively becomes simulations all the way down. It comes to this metaphysical, almost existential point where nobody can determine what reality is. I mean, for me, that's the strength of Neuromancer and the failure of the Matrix. It's the failure of the Matrix. The big failure that the Matrix set up is its binarism, the notion that there absolutely is an established absolute reality and an absolute simulation. It sort of edges towards the notion that that may not be the case, but it never really explores it to any great degree. Cypher says it in the first Matrix film. He says that he thinks the Matrix could be more real than the real world, and that's where it should have run. For me, that should have been the existential crisis, because of course the problem is, once you've set up the notion, you don't actually have to have it physically proven. Once you've set up the notion of a simulated reality like the Matrix, which is the definition of what reality is for those who operate in it, then any notion of reality itself collapses. There's no distinction. You can't determine between what is real and what is not. Okay, there's the process of awakening, seemingly, but then how can you ever determine that you haven't just woken into another layer of the simulation, or it's an entirely other simulation of a greater state of being that is also being simulated, that is also a byproduct of another simulation? You see how it's an infinite regress, ultimately. That once you've established the concept, that's it, it's over. And we have established the concept in our fiction. It's already there. It's been there for a lot longer than most people think. It's effectively the sort of Zen Buddhist notion of Am I a man, or am I a butterfly dreaming I'm a man, or am I a cabbage dreaming I'm a butterfly dreaming I'm a man? You can never determine, right? You can never determine. It's almost impossible. In fact, it is impossible once you've set up that notion, once you've set up that concept, and it's already set up within our reality, within our fiction. So existentially, we're in a bit of trouble. We are in a bit of trouble because we can never determine what is absolute, even if there is such a thing as absolutely real, we can never determine that. We lack the means currently to do that. And that's the existential crisis that stories like The Matrix should explore, but doesn't really. It sets up this binarism that makes it just like a conflict between good and evil, and that's not really that useful. Existentially speaking, that's really not that useful. Neuromancer, which massively inspired The Matrix, to the point whereby if I were William Gibson, I might have been getting onto my solicitors, quite frankly. Um, Neuromancer does it better. Neuromancer does it better because it doesn't pretend to answer. It doesn't pretend to give you an absolute answer at any point. It is massively confusing. It's massively confusing and deliberately so. You never know which of the incarnations of the protagonist you're following through whatever purportedly simulated version of reality is absolute, because ultimately none of them are. That's not the way the story works. It's designed to set up in the reader's mind that that uncertainty, that existential uncertainty where you don't really know whether you're operating in a simulated or fictional or contrived space or not. And I love that. I absolutely love that. Before William Gibson, of course, you have the previous generation of sci-fi authors. You have people like Philip K. Dick. And Philip K. Dick is the master of this. Philip K. Dick is the one of the best writers of existential anxiety I've ever come across. And the reason he's so good is because he's sincere. It's because it's something he felt in his own life. I mean, you read Veilus, you read Flow, My Tears, the Policeman Said, you read Human Ears, the collection of short stories, or what's that one that's Scanner Darkly, the one that was made into a beautiful shaded cell animation, a rotoscoped shaded cell animation in the early 2000s, late 1990s. That that is one of the most sincerely autobiographical works I've ever come across because it's William Gibb it, no it's it's Philip K. Dick's lived experience. It's as close to being autobiographical as a piece of fiction can be. That sense of being fried out, strung out, ultra paranoid, not only about external forces, but the internal as well, your own processes. Am I who I think I am? Or am I a contrivance? Am I a simulated thing? Am I a robot? Am I a clone? How can I tell if my memories are correct? And this is a preoccupation of Philip K. Dick's and gets more profound as his mental state collapses. In a way, what I was talking about earlier, these characters in fiction around whom the plot bends are a kind of byproduct of that. It's something as a writer you've just got to deal with. There will always be characters the plot bends around for convenience. Otherwise, you wouldn't have a plot. They trip over something, crack their skull open on the street, and that'd be the end, right? You have to have a world that bends around certain characters, your protagonists, largely. So, I mean, a really good example of this would be American Psycho. The film more than the book, interestingly. The book too, but the film more than the book. The book acknowledges that, or rather, the film acknowledges that the world in which Patrick Bateman operates is so hyper real, it's so obsessed with symbolic, with signs and signifiers, with what people wear, with the haircuts they get, with where they eat, that identity collapses. And because identity collapses, consequence collapses, personal responsibility collapses. In both the book and the film, characters can't determine who one another are because they all look the same, they all eat at the same places, they all have the same girlfriends, they all take the same drugs, they all have the same fucking business cards. And as a result, nobody can determine who anyone is. Even the private detective can't determine who these people are. He confuses them endlessly to the point where by the film's conclusion, and for me, the conclusion of the film is better than the conclusion of the book. The book goes on a little bit longer than it should, but the film concludes on this existential anxiety, where even Patrick Bateman doesn't know who he is, doesn't know like what's real anymore, what he's imagined, what he's actually done, whether there's any consequences coming to him because of what he's done or purportedly done, or if there's any purpose to this world in which he operates. There's just this hollow interaction between these Baudrillardian signs and signifiers. It's a simulation of a kind of reality in which identity is anathema. Even in fiction that doesn't acknowledge this happens because it has to. So look at something like Terminator. Look at Terminator 2. Look at the John O'Connor character John Connor character in Terminator 2. He should be dead multiple times over, but of course he isn't because the plot will not allow him to die. What's really fascinating to me, though, are characters whereby either they are aware of it or the plot is aware of it. Now, that is even more interesting when the writer is aware of the fact. One of my favorite pieces of fiction of all time, one of the texts that I just go back to again and again and again because it awes me, is Patrick Suskind's Perfume, the story of a murderer. Most people, when they talk about Perfume, they talk about its technical aspects. They talk about how beautifully Susskind communicates scent and aroma and perfume, which was one of his agendas with the book. And he does, I mean, it's correct. He does it so exquisitely. He does it so exquisitely, arguably better than anyone else operating in the world, any other writer that has ever been. He communicates scent and he communicates story through scent, the experience of scent. But what I love about the book more than anything is its metaphysics. It's the way Jean-Baptiste Grenouille, the character whose life the book follows, literally from birth to death, he is plot. He's like a black hole around which plot has no choice but to bend. He is very like Hannibal Lecter, actually, in the various different incarnations that he occurs. Jean-Baptiste Grenouille is not a real character. He is a fairy tale. He's a mythic archetype. He's Luciferian, effectively, dropped into a world that is very real, that operates along very real principles for everyone else, but not for him. And the plot knows it. The plot is so aware of the fact that this character is so absolute in terms of what he is, who he is, his aspects and his agendas, what he intends with his existence, that reality bends around him. One of the best examples of this, and it's actually a kind of literary and gallows joke. Whenever Jean Baptiste Grenouille encounters someone significant in his life, someone who changes the course or direction of his life, or rather gives him the means of pursuing his aspects further, of refining this perfect scent that he is attempting to create, they initially benefit from their contact with him, but he's done with them, once they can provide nothing else and he moves on, there's always a little subplot after, a deviation from the main plot, which explores how something terrible happens to them, something awful. So a really, really good example is the perfumier Baldini, beautifully played in the film adaptation by Dustin Hoffman. I mean, absolutely beautiful. That, by the way, if you want a film adaptation of a book that is sublime, go and watch the film of Patrick Suskind's Perfume, The Story of a Murderer. It is one of my favorites. It is one of the great unsung films, insofar as I'm concerned. I think it is absolutely stunningly beautiful. What happens to Baldini? Um, Granui comes across him completely, seemingly by accident, by complete chance, as he does almost everyone. But what it actually is the plot guiding him along his predestined path, of course. Um, he learns how to make perfume, like at its base, in terms of its technical aspects. He learns how to do it from Baldini. And once Baldini has basically taken advantage of Granui, secured himself a new reputation as a great perfumier, and Granui has moved on in his odyssey. Um, Baldini's little perfume shop where he lives, which is it's situated on a bridge across a river, just collapses and he dies. That's the kind of thing that happens all the time to everyone Granui encounters, and it's a great example of the plot bending around him in the same way that the way he encounters people, which is seemingly by chance, who usher him along in his odyssey, in his pilgrimage. Every single one of them does exactly that. He comes across them at the right time, in the right circumstances, seemingly by chance. And it's that wonderful, wonderful pinpoint balance of plot and fate and circumstance, where it's almost comical, it's almost contrived to the point of absurdity, but works because of the nature of Granui. I love this stuff. I love this stuff to bits. It doesn't always work. It can be too on the nose, when it's too fourth wall breaking or when it's too conscious of itself. Then it becomes problematic. Then it becomes problematic. Or when it just doesn't have any panache, when it doesn't have any rhyme or rhythm about itself. But I absolutely love this. I love this notion as a concept. This comes up all the time in my own fiction because it's a preoccupation. Characters who break the world, they break the laws of reality around themselves, either through their desperation or their despair or their need or their want or their desire or their abjection. There's something they are dissatisfied with, and that it becomes a kind of gravity. It becomes a kind of vandalistic gravity that breaks the story around them. That is a preoccupation of mine and has been ever since I wrote Strange Playgrounds, my first short story collection. And it's something that comes up again and again and again and again and again. Almost all the characters in my fiction do this to some greater or lesser degree. And it's something I really love. I really, really love it when it's done well. When it's done well, it turns seemingly banal stories into fairy tales and into myths. It turns very standard plots into something new, into something beautiful. And it's something that's keenly associated, obviously, with what's generally called the speculative genre, so horror, fantasy, and science fiction, because by their very nature, they contain elements that break the laws of reality. It's keenly associated with horror when you have ghost stories, for example. I mean, Stanley Kubrick's The Shining. Stanley Kubrick's The Shining is a great example of this. The Overlook is plot, it's history. The Overlook is this great suppurating wound in American history that draws on all of the evil, all of the atrocity that is part and parcel of the USA's past, and becomes this giant resonator that warps and bends reality and history and plot around itself to the point whereby it draws people out of their own historical lines and into its own, which we see at the end, of course, when we see Jack in the photograph from the 1920s, which is impossible. It's drawn him into that historical cycle where history doesn't mean anything anymore, where plot doesn't mean anything anymore. The hotel itself bends plot around Jack because it wants him to do stuff. It wants him to feed Danny to it effectively. And Danny bends plot around himself because he is this character. I mean, that's what The Shining is. That's what The Shining in King's fiction is. It's the ability of a character to see what's going on in the plot. That's effectively it. You see it all the time with satanic characters. Luciferian characters do this so often. Look at Al Pacino's character in The Devil's Advocate, who is literally Satan. He is the author of that story. He is weaving all that story around Keanu Reeves's character to draw him to a particular point. The problem is, of course, Keanu Reeves's character is aware of that fact and therefore has a kind of agency, has what is referred to within the story as free will. And that's a problem for the satanic character, for the author, because he operates outside of his jurisdiction. And those of us who write know this happens. We know this happens. It's part of the process, actually. Characters do weird fucking things that you never intended them to do. They break the plot that you intend for them. Anyone who plays D&D knows that people do this. Have you ever been a DM in a D&D game or a role-playing game and your characters just do something that your campaign does not account for. And suddenly the whole campaign changes around them. That's it. That's the process. And it's something I love so much. And it's something that really good cinema, TV, fiction in general, when it gets it, when it understands that this is what is happening, it can make absolute beauty out of itself.